This hour of broadcasting brought to you by TwoWayRadioCenter.com, a Motorola value-added reseller. Welcome to the Church Safety and Security broadcast with the Church Safety Guys. Brought to you by Vigilant Impact. The Church Safety Guys is a nonprofit organization dedicated to equipping the vigilant, those men and women who stand watch, keeping our houses of worship and places of faith safe. We believe church safety and security must be a ministry first and have engaged, servant leaders who continually strive for excellence and teams of motivated volunteers that are always training. Join us for the next hour as the Church Safety Guys unpack safety, security, leadership, and ministry operations with your hosts, Dr. James McGarvey and Mike Scully. This broadcast is also available on YouTube, your favorite podcast platforms, churchsafetyguys.com, and on the original Church Security app. Download it today. Feel free to like, subscribe, and share with your ministry.
Well, hello. Welcome to the Church Safety and Security broadcast with the Church Safety Guys. I am James, and once again joined by my co-host, Mike.
Good evening. How are you?
I am doing well, I think. How are you doing on this Sunday? It feels like it's been about a year since we did a broadcast.
I mean, I know we take some time off in December this past year for around the holidays and chance to recharge and renew, but even with way the holidays fell this year and Mother's Day and Memorial Day, and I traveled to a conference and it just was hard to put the show together. Remotely.
It really was. My wife does travel agent stuff on the side, and so coming out of COVID, interestingly, there have been a lot of large companies that have been pushing special discounts and deals to travel agents to get people back in certain areas, amusement parks, cruises, that sort of thing. And so we actually had an amazing opportunity, and that opportunity was actually on my wife's bucket list. So you know how
there you go.
You know how that goes and what happens when your wife's not happy. So no, it was she actually got a invitation from I believe it was Royal Caribbean to an extremely discounted cruise to Alaska. And so again, that's one of those things where we've always wanted to do it. We just haven't had the time and the resources. And so it was extremely affordable, and kind of to that point where it was like, okay, I think now's the time. We actually managed to carve out a week. We flew up to Vancouver, British Columbia, and then left from Vancouver went up to Alaska, and then came back down. So
nice.
It was really great. I unplugged most of the guys. For those of you that are listening, most of the folks associated with Church Safety Guys were texting me and saying, "Don't you dare answer! Don't respond to this email offline."
Yep.
So special thanks to Mike and Jared and Glenn, and I think Dwayne was in there a couple of times too, where he was like, "Okay, you need to take time off, go enjoy. The world will not, stop revolving since you're away from a computer."
Yeah.
So, and it was funny too, because real quick story. I told, I was talking to John Riley this past week, and I told him, so we actually had a chance to go to a club, or I guess it was a bar on the cruise ship. And of course the bar part of it was closed. I didn't go there for that. But the interesting thing was it was actually we found out it was the highest point of the ship. And so we had, glass windows, panoramic views, et cetera, et cetera. And so we were just sitting there like taking pictures. We got a chance to see the mountains. We saw orcas, playing in the water and that sort of thing. And of course, a group of 4 or 5 people came up and were rather intoxicated. And so my wife and I are sitting there just talking, looking out, taking pictures, and these folks jump in and start harassing other people in the cabin or other people in the club, just making a big deal, being pretty obnoxious. And so I'm sitting there and I went to say, okay, let's get up. I was about that point, like I'm kind of watching it. I'm like, they're being so loud, we need to just leave. And actually 2 security officers for the ship came in and walked up. And it was interesting because I sat there and I kind of watched how they de-escalated the situation, how they handled it, because their security, I mean, they don't carry firearms because they go internationally. So I think they had like handcuffs on them or whatever. But they came up and one of the guys, the folks that were, or folks that had been partying and drinking, were like basically to that point where they were starting to, you could just tell like their body tensed up. They were getting ready to start swinging and stuff. And I kind of looked over and I was like, you know what, if it comes to that, I will go over and I'll help the security guard, whatever, I'll be on that side, because I kind of saw the whole thing. And so I was kind of like positioning myself to, to remove my wife and to go over and help the guy.
Yep.
And I watched and I listened to him for about 5 or 10 minutes. And I talked to John Riley about it. And it was amazing to me that they did a phenomenal job. Like both of the officers were uh, really right there. And they were like, hey, let's talk about this. Why are you so upset? Why are you frustrated? You need to go back to your cabin. And so they were able to very successfully de-escalate the situation. And it impressed me a lot with them, with the cruise line. It impressed me on how they handled the situation and how they handled it. And it was very quickly resolved. There weren't any ramifications or anything from that. And my wife and I finished taking pictures, and then we went back on to do our thing. But it was interesting to me. I'm seeing more and more of that. And of course, going different places and having that opportunity, going on vacation, it's like you're never you're never shut off. Like you're always looking, you're always doing stuff, you always need to be on alert. But to me, it was kind of interesting. I felt less than comfortable, even though it was Alaska. There's a different culture. There's very much a firearm culture. And so, I mean, I walked into a grocery store and they were selling groceries right next to firearms.
It's a cold Texas.
I think it is. Although we had gorgeous weather. It was probably in the 70s and
there you go.
Sunny, and everybody was saying this weather never happens. So, you've got a good week when, when the locals are like, this shouldn't be this way, but it is. So yeah, we had an awesome time. It was great to kind of recharge and step away. And from that standpoint, my wife and I spent some good time together without the kids and just kind of relaxed, and it was it's good.
It's always good to recharge, renew, just have a chance to step away from it all and get that additional energy back.
For sure. So on this broadcast for this Sunday, since we're back, we want to talk about leadership. And of course, that's something that we usually try and talk about once a month, and we've had the chance to talk to a few churches and do assessments and different things like that, where the question has come up about leadership, like why is it necessary to have leaders or individuals that are overseeing a safety team? Why is it necessary to have it in the church? I've had people in the past say it's not a biblical concept. You're being in charge of this or that or the other thing. And so for the broadcast today or the podcast, I just started thinking about it, and I thought, what if leadership didn't exist? And I want to kind of dive down that rabbit hole a little bit. And certainly, everything we do is biblically focused, or we do our best to make it biblically focused. So I want to start back in Genesis, and I think it's interesting. I'm not going to go verbatim, certainly through every every passage, because if you Google leadership in the Bible, there's a whole lot of stuff that comes up.
It's a lot there, and it could be its own book by itself.
It could. Hey, no, we're not. I'm not writing a book on that.
I know
right
we already have a backlog.
So, but what's interesting to me, I always like to go back to the beginning. Obviously, Genesis is the beginning. I like to go back and I like to look at God's character, and I like to look at what is God doing through his actions to set that example and require that standard. And so two things kind of popped up in when I started kind of looking through some of that content, some of that ideology. The first thing was when God created the world, right? In the beginning, first 3 chapters of Genesis, God was very systematic and very orderly on what day he created what. And for sake of time, we don't have time to go into every single day and the meaning, but if you do some research, and I would encourage everyone to do that, you'll see that on certain days, God did certain things in order. And then on the 7th day, God rested and said it was good. And so to me, I always like to, again, connect everything back to the beginning. But maybe that's in a perfect world, that's the system. And so we live in a fallen world, and there are times when we need to adjust and overcome. And maybe that's where some of the hardship comes from. But in reality, when we look at it and we see that picture in that example, God is very organized and structured. And then when we move forward, we'll go next to the people of Israel when Moses had taken them out of Egypt. And again, that's in Exodus, Leviticus, and the next couple of books of the Old Testament. But when we move forward, we're seeing that to move that vast amount of people out of Israel. Now, I mean, there's a lot of numbers out there. What I was seeing was saying mostly like about 2 million people, right? So you think, Moses couldn't by himself just do this, right? But what was interesting was that the people of the Levites, or what Leviticus is written after, those individuals had the responsibility of making sure that the sacrifices were taken care of, the worship, the church service, if you will, for the people to communicate with God and to have that interaction with God. And so when I look at that and you look at the detail that God was like, hey, don't do this, do this. And obviously that was setting up for the law, and we can't, obviously, making the presence, or making the picture that, we can't of ourselves, we can't be perfect. We can't do everything per se that God wants us to do. But there's a lot of really fantastic things to think about from the standpoint of God, again, is very much into order and very much into staying away from chaos. And so if you remember, at one point, Moses went up in the mountain to get the 10 commandments. He comes back down. The people had broken, really broken God's trust. They were worshiping this idol. Moses went to Aaron, who was supposed to be in charge. And I know you're going to talk about failed leadership with this, but I'm thinking, I think about that, and I think Moses comes back down the mountain and he's like, hey, what's going on, to the person that was supposed to be doing it, right? That was supposed to be leading, and he wasn't. And so Aaron literally comes back and says to him, look, I just threw this stuff in a pot and this is what happened. Right.
Yep.
And it's like, dude, even I know, like, I even knew at a little child reading that's like, you accepted no accountability whatsoever for this being bad. Like, this is a bad situation. So, to me, it's, again, there's several other things, several other areas, in the Old Testament. Exodus 18, verses 15 in that chapter, but 15 specifically, where Moses's father, and we've talked about this before, Moses's father-in-law comes to him and says, you're killing yourself. Stop stressing yourself out. You have to have a leadership structure. You have to delegate. You have to trust people, because you're burning yourself out and you're going to die. Like, you're so weary from listening to people's problems. And imagine that, like, how I don't know how I would handle 2 million people coming to me with every single tiny little problem.
Yeah. Like pastors.
Huh. I don't know. I've never had, maybe that's a blessing. I've never had pastors that came to me and were like,
Well, no, I'm saying people
extremely
going to
needy.
them. People
Oh,
go to the
yeah.
pastors all the time. Like, that's
Well,
what
yeah.
their ear is always being tucked off by every little detail.
Yeah. And there's a lot of trust with setting up and building and coaching and mentoring and obviously that sort of thing. But that's, to me, and that's kind of the low hanging fruit on the Old Testament. But, we see structure, we see God being a God of structure and organization, and being very detailed, very specific on how things should be, how they aren't happening. And so, we never see, and what's interesting is, the part about Moses' father-in-law coming back to him. We never see anything in the Old Testament about God disagreeing with that, right? God was very vocal about things, and that's really one of the things that caught my attention, was that we never see God coming back and saying to Moses, don't do what Jethro said. In fact, if anything, Moses was able to assign leaders. They assigned a leadership structure within the Israelites, and it prospered. Like, God blessed it because there was order, there was structure. And if you go on, if you move forward to the New Testament, one of the most well-known references, I think, is 1 Corinthians 14:33, which Paul is saying that God is a God of order. He's talking about the church service and how things need to be done within the church. And, in the New Testament, one of the key things is, when a writer, whether it was Jesus or someone else, when someone said something and they repeated themselves, it was like, I'm not just saying this, but when you repeat yourself again, because of the Greek language and how it's presented, it was one of those things where it was like, okay, hey, I'm like smacking you upside the head. Pay attention to what I'm saying, like that level of importance. And so in that passage in 1 Corinthians 14, which is right after, obviously, right after the love passage, the Apostle Paul is saying, look, church services, worship services need to have order. And he actually repeats himself and says it again a few verses later. And he says, regardless of what you're doing and how you worship, essentially make sure that you are worshiping in a way that is honoring to God. And that way of worshiping that brings honor to God is through having order. And so when I think about that along those lines, that kind of tells me that, it is important. Like, every ministry that's within the church should have leadership, should have direction, should have purpose. But again, collectively, all of those ministries should be unified and connected together as much as above to the mission and the purpose of the church. So I'll throw it over to you and let you jump in there.
Yeah, no, it's great to unpack and start with kind of theme text, with not to take the show down a Sunday morning sermon part two, but at the same point, there's a lot there that's worth anchoring ourselves to. Of course, when we're understanding where do we go and what are we called to be as leaders. So, really, what I wanted to kind of add is that when leadership is lacking in an organization or in a ministry, that managing tends to fill in the gap. It's
Sure.
almost like it naturally just falls right into that gap there. And so oftentimes you may find it creates a bunch of issues within your team because frankly, humans resist being managed. They want to be led. They want to follow. They don't want to be told, hey, you must do this, you shall do that. And so it's a matter of choice, and that free choice comes back biblically, of course, where we choose to take advantage or to listen and to follow. And so that's a big one for me is that idea that managing is sometimes the filler of that gap. Oftentimes
sure.
folks look at management and leadership and think of them as the same thing when in fact they're not. So when you try to manage a situation, when you should be showing leadership characteristics, you'd often make the situation worse. And so you can find that kind of spiral or that rabbit hole of using the wrong tactics, using the wrong approach, and then it just makes the situation worse. Now, if we apply that in a crisis management mode, which as a safety team, hey, we're responding, we're dealing with something. Maybe it's not crisis level, but it could be something where, hey, we need to act in a positive way. Well, if you manage it and you're just managing those tasks, and don't get me wrong, there's part to that process that does need management and oversight and scrutiny. But if you set an example and lead with your team, you're going to actually have a good pattern to follow. And now it's not just box checking, but actually going out and delivering on a purpose, the why you are there. So we're big on, of course, ministry first, and we talk a lot about that. And I think the opposite of that is that managers will often put themselves, their task, something that happened yesterday or the last service or at home on the way car ride to church, they'll put that first. All those things become distractions versus the ministry, which is our first and foremost. So that leads to kind of a lack of vision. Managers often manage work. So all those things
Sure.
we need to do on a Sunday morning, whether it's the rounds or whether it's checking in with different ministry leads before they get started for the Sunday morning, we're going to, as leaders, try to equip and engage them on an ongoing basis, not just, again, check boxes. And then if from a go ahead if you wanted to jump there.
Well, I was just going to say real quick, I always used to say, I mean, I agree with you 100%. I always used to say, and for 13, 14 years, I was in retail management, but the difference, I used to say the difference between leadership or the term leading and managing was that managing was just accomplishing the task. Like you're only doing that specific task, and leadership is like coaching, going along with and essentially what you just said, just a different way of saying it.
Sure.
But at the same time, it's very easy, and I'm not and I know you're not discounting the necessity of doing activities. Like that's not
Right.
what you're saying at all. I mean, we know we have routines, and we have routines for a reason. But when we become too focused, and this isn't, I mean, I'm not just saying, we're not just saying this out there. This is something that I've struggled with before, overseeing a team, running a team. And, just in general in ministry, you get so focused on procedures and policy and how we should do this, and this, cross the T's, dot the I's, that we're forgetting that effective leadership, effective hospitality, effective engagement comes from interacting with our volunteers, interacting with the folks that are visiting, and thereby boosting the vision of the church and the mission of the church, really.
Right. Absolutely. And you said it right there, is the kind of doing things, getting stuff done. And that's the management mode of, I have to get this done, or these things
Sure.
have to be done before I go home. So we get into very management mode. And I see that myself as well when it's in my own household, the tendency to go from being a leader in my household, a leader of bringing my family to church, to
Mm-hmm.
just managing the task of getting the three littles out the door and wearing clothes and having shoes and not looking disheveled and getting them to church on time. That can get to be very managed, but I'm doing it with purpose. I'm doing it with intention. I'm trying to lean on the side from a leadership perspective. So it's not just about doing things.
Mm-hmm.
Leaders want to do the right things right. So it's about identifying the things that need to truly happen and make those right choices and then do them well at the same time. It's about maintaining and developing people, not just maintaining. Okay, it's both.
And I think honestly, that's the key. That's the difference, really the secret sauce, if you will, of having a successful, if I can say it, a successful safety team, because you're focused on doing the things that are immediate, that are in front of you, that are important.
Right.
But at the same time, you're also focused on, those that are doing it with you. It's not just, well, I'm going to go, I'm going to tell you to go do this. I always tried, when I specifically had a team, I would always try and do, whatever it was that I was asking other people. So if I ask someone to go sit out in the parking lot, then I would work myself into that rotation and I'd go sit with them, or I'd go, out there and do that shift as well. So I think that, honestly, and I think that it's very easy, like you said. I mean, I do the same thing for my family, and my kids aren't as young as yours are. It's like, we have my cousin here in July, middle of July, is getting married. And so we have 6 schedules in our house, right? And I feel like an air traffic control guy, because I've got a calendar where I've got my wife and my schedule, our work schedule. My 3 daughters now have significant work schedules where they're, running in and out to work, doing this, doing that. My son really doesn't have much of a schedule other than playing the Switch and watching Disney Plus on occasion, which I've got to, like, I finally said to him, I'm like, okay, you need to go grab a book. You need to do something non-electronic here. But what's interesting is, for this wedding, I'm like trying to coordinate everybody's schedule. And finally, I'll tell you, yesterday, I got really irritated, but kept my composure. I had to RSVP for the wedding. And so my parents are coming out, and I was like, and I keep getting all these excuses. Like, my kids are like, no, I can't do that because I've got this and I've got that. And I'm like, finally, I just said no. And they just kind of looked at me, and I'm like, this is what we're doing. Like, your grandparents are coming out, they're spending time with us, and we don't have a lot of weddings to go to. So you took a day off to go to a concert of an artist that I can't even pronounce. I'm like, so guess what? Your grandparents are going. You're going to spend some time with your grandparents and family. You're going to the wedding.
Yep.
So, at times it's funny. It's like that patriarchal like oversight. And I don't know, I don't say that often, and they know that. So from that standpoint, I said, you know what? It's important to me, not that you go to a wedding.
Right.
Maybe some, people that you don't know, or, you might not remember in the future, but spend time as a family, because one day you'll look back and you won't have that time, and you'll think, wow, I really wish I had spent more time with grandma and grandpa, or, that sort of thing. And, I mean, you guys live a little bit further away from your parents, so how that goes for sure. But from a ministry standpoint, bringing that back in, you have to, obviously, we're not saying don't have some policies, some procedures. You've got to have an outlying structure of order, in the sense of, there has to be direction to understand and to function. And so many times, I mean, we do assessments, and we've been doing them very frequently lately, left and right. We've been doing a lot of them, um, which is great. But in talking to some churches, you know there have been questions. One of the questions I'll ask is, what does your policies and procedures look like? And I'll get like this deer in the headlights look, and I have on a couple occasions. And I'm like, okay, you're trying to set up a team, but you don't have that foundation. You don't have order to be able to connect everything to understand what the importance is, because you can't train people. You can't have people do things consistently across the board, in a safety and security environment, and not have that. So
Right.
you need to have that, but at the same time, also understanding that there's a certain connection as leaders. You're enforcing that, but at the same time, by having that and working with that individual, you're engaging with them to accomplish a much greater, much larger task.
Absolutely. Well, and you're saying right there the important things. And that's where I think there's another difference, is that managers often are there counting the value and trying to say, hey, I did this, hey, I did that. And they're looking at the hash marks on their, well, how many did I get inside the center ring? How many, they're looking at all these stats. And so they're trying to
Yeah,
count value. Where I think leaders on the other side are more about identifying ways to create that value. So, what is value? What is that value I can bring to my team? What is the value that I can bring to my church? What is the value I can bring to God? And always looking at it from that perspective.
for sure. For sure. I'll let you go on to what you were going to say.
Sure. Well, and then it looks at from our we talked about response before, and you're
Right.
talking about policies and procedures and order and structure and so forth. But beyond that, once you're in place, once you kind of have that structure, once you're organized, you have those policies and procedures, and hopefully are training regularly. There's another difference: is are you managing your team in a way as such you're likely to be reactive, meaning you're waiting for something to happen and you're going to react. Now, we all have to react and be ready to be observing, orienting, and acting, essentially. But are you doing things that are proactive? What are you doing to mitigate? Are you doing things around your facility to make sure that you're going to reduce the risk of crime? Are you doing things that in your are you testing your policies and procedures in a proactive way to make sure that they actually will stand up to the test of actually running them through, kind of whether it's tabletop or a scenario where you're working through with your team? So don't wait for it to happen. Work through it proactively, and then that way you've already kind of rehearsed some of those things when you get to that point. And then finally, if you're running your team, is you want to make sure you're continuing to lead, because that's more of a matter of seeking influence. You want them to follow you as a leader. You're not seeking to hold power over their head as a manager.
And I think, honestly, too, I'm going to jump on that real quick, because I think that's an excellent point. There's a difference between leading and serving with someone and with volunteers versus lording it over them. And I mean, we've all been in situations where we had individuals that were over us, whether it was at church or in ministry or at work or that sort of thing, where you just didn't get along with the person because you didn't see eye to eye.
Right.
It's not about that. It's not about going and saying and doing something, um, and certainly you don't want that interaction in the middle of an incident where you're trying to mitigate something. But it's not about, driving the factor of saying, you know what, you need to do this because I said you need to do this. If you get to that point where you're actually saying that, then you've missed the boat somewhere. Like somewhere along the line, there's been a train wreck, and
Yep.
we need to get that train back on the rails, because the truth is, again, you're not connecting. Like if I have to say that, and I'll use my kids as an example.
I was just going to
If
go
I
there.
I beat you to it.
Yep.
If I have to tell my son, if my son does something and maybe he disobeyed, or maybe he chose poorly with his decision making process, if I have to tell him, hey, you need to go do this because I told you to do this. Now, if it's the second or third time and it's our kids, I get that. Then maybe there's a little bit of latitude and leeway there. But at the same time, there are times when you're dealing with obviously adults. We're talking about individuals that can think and interact on their own without your direct oversight, or family oversight.
Yep.
But when I'm interacting with someone, if I'm talking to a volunteer or something like that, it shouldn't, there shouldn't be an interaction where I'm like saying, look, you need to go do this because I said to. Like, if they don't understand it to that point, then you need to try and re-explain it so that they understand it, because in truth, if they go do something or try and do something, I would almost guarantee 100% that it's not going to turn out the way you wanted it to turn out, because they didn't understand it. They may not be pushing back. Now, I mean, there's always exceptions to every rule, but they may
Right.
not be specifically pushing back on that thing. It could very easily just be one of those things where I don't understand the reasoning behind why we're doing what we're doing, and what this looks like, and what the potential end result would be. And maybe at that point, that's where you say, okay, you know what, let's have a conversation about this real quick, if you have time. If you don't have time, then it's very easy to say, you know what, I'd love to explain this to you more, but we're tied up, we've got to get this done quickly. Can we come back to this? Like, could you do this activity, and then I will swing back around later and we can sit down and chat about this when we have a little bit more time.
Yep.
And that's fair. Like, if you have somebody, if one of your volunteers or one of your folks is frustrated and they're like, well, no, I want to know now, you know what, that person probably shouldn't be on the safety team. I mean,
Yep.
in all fairness, because it's like, we all need to be flexible. We all need to be understanding and realize that there's a time and a place for everything. So
I think it translates not just to line level, the volunteer themselves, but all the way even to leadership. So back to the purpose of the show tonight is, without leadership, I'd kind of argue that your team is already in crisis, because if you're lacking leadership, you're probably already in crisis or management mode as a team.
by
If you
someone, like someone's doing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So and you may have it as a couple of different ways. You kind of spoke to it from the volunteer perspective of somebody who's unable. Well, if they're unable, they either don't possess the necessary leadership skills or understanding of how to do it as a leader, if they're unable to lead, or they need to be equipped further. So maybe they're just not ready to fully lead. And so they drift back to those things that I started with, kind of on the managing side. If you have somebody who is kind of equipped but unable, well, that may be a bad leader. They've been equipped, they've been taught, they've been coached, they've been trained. Maybe there can be some more coaching. Maybe there can be some more guiding and over time. But the lack of leadership is really a whole different ballgame. So that lack of leadership, especially during a time of crisis, as I mentioned a bit earlier, that can be devastating and really lead to an even bigger crisis. You can make a bad thing worse because you don't have the right leadership. And then finally, if you have somebody from a leadership perspective who is just unwilling, very often we tend to focus on the perspective that it's just, oh, they're apathetic, they have no interest in leadership whatsoever. Okay. Well, that's not always the case. Sometimes you may have individuals that are potentially situationally or risk averse. So to that sense is not all risk, but the risk of leadership. And the risk of leadership is around, hey, I'm fearful of what it might do to my relationships. I'm fearful of what it might do to my image. I'm fearful of what it might do if am I going to be blamed for the entire team? those sorts of things are potentially things that can be mitigated and coached, and then take that person who has that aversion or that risk up to leadership and kind of train them or coach them out of it. And you may find that you have somebody who's now willing and able to be equipped.
And that's honestly, that's the truth. I mean, I don't think I was going to say we're and go in collectively, but I'll say it from my perspective. I don't think I've ever had a day serving in safety and security. And this might sound, I don't know, crazy to some people, but I don't think I've ever had a day where I wasn't fearful of something. And when I say fearful, it's not, oh, I'm scared that this isn't going to work out, or maybe we have to problem solve and figure something out, because I thrive on that. I love the okay, throw me a problem, let's problem solve, let's make this better, let's fix it, let's move forward. And maybe that kind of makes me a little bit unique and kind of weird, but at the same time, I don't go looking for problems. I I like a quiet Sunday, trust me. But when I think about it, and when I think through, okay, not a Sunday goes by that I'm not scared or nervous. I guess nervous is probably a better word.
Probably a better word,
Nervous
yeah.
about something, because there's so much going on. And 10 or 15 years ago, again, we would have never thought necessarily about having a safety team. Now we do. Our society has changed and our culture has changed. So that makes us more apprehensive of, doing things the right way, responding correctly, doing that sort of thing. We want to make sure that the folks that we're serving with are truly engaged. We want to make sure that we're motivating them, and we want to make sure that we're actually connecting with them, because there's probably, if your church is like my church, there's probably at least 6 or 7 other ministries that they could go serve in, right? And so safety and security is an investment. It's a thing where we invest, we train someone, we want them to stick around and serve in that capacity for a long period of time. So we don't want to do anything to kind of kick them out unless they need to find another ministry to serve in, because that's just not an appropriate ministry for them. But the truth is, how you have yourself set up with, we call it, in the 4 pillars, we call it operational excellence, with policies and procedures. How that's set up makes a lot of difference. If you're trying to get people in, and I'll throw this out there real quick. If you're trying to recruit people for your organization, and I say organization, in your church, you're trying to recruit people for safety and security, and people aren't interested or aren't connecting in that ministry to volunteer, it's very possible that you could have a climate, culture, aura of no leadership. Because when you don't have policies and procedures, when you don't have that connecting leadership, oftentimes when you're trying to get somebody to come in from the outside, we don't always see it, because we're like, like that tunnel vision, like I'm focused right here on serving and doing this and doing that. But bringing someone in from the outside oftentimes can be very revealing, to say, hey, look at all of this. Tell me what I'm doing good. Tell me what I'm not doing good. Help me out here. But oftentimes when we bring those outside people in, they get a different opinion or approach on how you do stuff. And that doesn't mean you necessarily have to change. But my point is that oftentimes volunteers can sense instability, for lack of a better word.
Absolutely. Well, with leadership becomes responsibility, and we have responsibility to handle things differently and to approach it all differently. So I think with that, I have 6 keys for good leadership and what it brings. So all are going to be E's, of course, shocking, or R's, not tonight, E's tonight. Engagement. James talked about it already. Enablement. Are they ready? Do they have the right amount of training, and can they do the job successfully, or are they set up to fail? Are we encouraging them to make sure they feel like they're ready for this? Are they being appreciated? Empowerment. Are they given that opportunity to truly step up and take that opportunity and do the role? With leadership comes good efficiency. You're going to be able to do things smarter and better and wiser. And then most importantly, with good leadership, there's empathy involved. It's not again about you must or you shall. It's compassion, it's understanding, it's having empathy for your team and understanding life happens. Situations happen on Sunday morning. Not everything's going to go perfect all of the time, and you shouldn't be so rigid that takes you off your game. So 6 keys.
Well, and again, I'm gonna jump on empowerment real quick because I don't feel like we've talked too much about that. But the truth is that that team, that ministry should operate and things should happen well when you're not there. And that doesn't always happen. I mean, there are times when you do have to go back and you have to acknowledge and say, you know what, we made a mistake. This didn't operate. This didn't happen the way it should have happened.
Right.
Instead of basking in the misery of failure, right? Because we all hate failure. We all want to be successful, whatever we're in. Take a step back and say, okay, this failed, but how
Right.
can we fix it? How can we move forward to do this better? And we've had that before too. We've had situations. I took 2 years ago, I took a Sunday off to go, actually go canoeing with my family, my kids. I wasn't there. We had a medical at the church. We had a medical emergency happen, and there were some opportunities with how it was handled by the folks that were there. So when I got back, I sat down with key people, and said, "Okay, I'm not criticizing. Tell me what happened. Let's look at everything." But the truth of it is, with the empowerment piece, we can't do everything ourselves. Even if
Right.
you're the only safety person or security person, connect with someone else that is good with leadership or leading people, and maybe do a first aid class. If it's a smaller church, do a first aid class with them, but so that you have somebody else there that's potentially trained to know how to step in and do stuff. There's certainly plenty of different things that you can do, but if you do have an established team that you're trying to connect with and whatnot, empowerment is a very, very powerful training item, training attribute. Because if I empower somebody to do something, I'm giving them the authority to be successful. And of course, I'm not just going to throw it at them and say, "Hey, take this and walk away," but I'm going to make sure that they're successful with the results of that. And so that's really where, in a sense, coaching and discipleship can come in too, because I'm focused on that and helping them be successful with whatever task it is,
Sure.
to empower them so that they're comfortable with whatever they might be afraid of. And I think
Absolutely.
honestly, the efficiency and empathy, those I could very easily connect, and I won't, because of the sake of time, but I could very easily connect those back to servant leadership, right? We
Yep.
have the resource, the book on servant leadership, and there's basically 10 keys. One of them is empathy. And it's like understanding and knowing that, look, things happen. I can't beat somebody up for not being there at church. Like, when my when my schedule is perfect, I've got 10 people serving, I'm ready to go, I'm ready to hit this day, and 5 show up, and the other 5 call off sick or have something happen or whatever.
Yep.
I can't be non-empathetic, because if I am, I'm basically chipping away at that individual's reserve for patience towards me in leadership. So I have to be relaxed enough to say, you know what? Okay, those 5 people, they didn't show up. I guess they had stuff go on. Now I'll reach out to them and I'll connect with them. But the truth is, okay, I need to be understanding to move forward and say, okay, I still need to get done what I have to get done today. How can I do that with 5 people? And how can I'm not going to stomp my feet. I'm not going to babysit someone either. To an extent, if someone wants to serve on a particular ministry, they need to be responsible as well. So there's always a fine line balance. And I'm not trying to paint this rosy picture of, oh, this is how, every situation is unique and different, for sure. But at the same time, applying those and really trying to look at, do a deep dive and look into, okay, what's the culture like of this team? What's happening? Is there engagement? Is there enablement? Are we encouraging? Are we empowering? That's the difference of getting someone or having someone actually serve on a regular basis. Like you'll have them, um, coming back for a long a long time if you apply those different things. That's an amazing way to connect with them.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I'll throw it over to you real quick. You can throw in your closing thoughts and then I'll wrap it up.
Well, I mean, a lot to unpack with the different parts of the show tonight, but I think there's so many pieces there, and there's so much material out there on leadership. So we're by no means bringing it all forward, but highlighting some of the things that are important and really looking at it from that reverse. What happens if I don't have that leadership? So if I don't have that leadership, is your team growing? Are they being challenged? And are they actually going to be able to rise to the experience that they might face one day? So think about it through that perspective and that responsibility that we have as leaders to sow that leadership mindset into our team. And then as a final thought is really that I often find that in my own walk that if I feel like, I'm not leading, or I'm not following the call that I have, and I'm not perfectly in line with what God wants, I think God puts stuff on our plate to manage, frankly. In other words, I feel like I end up in a period of time where it's managing chaos, managing stress, some sort of thing that goes wrong, whether it's the AC goes out, I have to replace and manage a dishwasher install. And all those things happen, and I get it happens to everybody, but I feel like at times it's like you have that feast or famine mindset at times where I feel like there's times of feasting, and it's really where it feels like everything's going right, and things are aligned, and you're leading and following God, and you feel like you're directly in that call. And then there's times where you feel like for whatever reason there's drift, and that's the time I feel like God puts things to manage on your plate.
I think that's probably a whole separate episode.
It could be
on its own, by itself, standalone episode. So for next month, when we talk about it. No, I mean, I agree with you. I think that, and I spoke a little bit about this with the book coming back, and we're working on a few other presentations collectively, because we have several conferences coming up and different things like that we're trying to plan for next year, for the end of this year, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, it's hard, but when you're looking at stuff, and you're trying to have a positive attitude and you're trying to move forward with it, oftentimes the ministry, like the people that you work or serve with, those are the individuals that kind of take the brunt of that frustration. And so sometimes it can be really hard to be metered and to just kind of be encouraging, but at the same time, like with my emotions, like I'll come in and I'll be like, oh my gosh, I just had a horrible week, but I've got to get in this right mindset to serve, because otherwise I'm not going to have discernment or wisdom in handling what I handle. But to me, when you look at that, it kind of makes you more personal, from the standpoint of, stuff happens to everybody. We all have good weeks and bad weeks, and realistically, there are times when, again, when we've had situations where I've stepped in, where I've had a leader call me and say, you know what, I've got this going on right now and I can't be focused enough on, this at church. And so I would step in and say, okay, I've got this. And there have been times when I've said that, I'm working on a family situation, or this week has been a horrible week. We had, the car break, the dishwasher break, the freezer shut down. if I had a dog, it probably would have had a vet bill
Yeah.
or something crazy like that. But the truth is, looking at it as a whole, we have to be real. We have to be transparent, and we're all learning, right? We have to learn how to handle things together and understand that, none of us are perfect. And as we do ministry, as we do things together, um, leadership is important, direction is important, but how we do that is even more important. And so we want to make sure that we keep a positive attitude, but at the same time, do things in a way that certainly brings glory and honor to God and supports the ministry and why we're here. So, but with that note, we definitely appreciate you all hanging out with us on the broadcast. And certainly you can reach out to us through our website, which is churchsafetyguys.com. And we're happy to help you however we can, help your ministry, your house of worship. There's plenty of resources on the website. There's plenty of resources on our social media groups, and then also the church security app. And much of what we talked about today really on this podcast kind of connects back to the 4 Pillars book, which I will shamelessly plug for a second and throw on my camera there so you can see it. But definitely consider getting a copy of that. And then we have a devotional study guide group study that goes along with that as well, that can kind of help guide you through some of what we talked about on this broadcast. And if we can help you out with any of that, again, please reach out to us and let us know. We're happy to do that. On next week's broadcast, we will be back next week. This last time, it was kind of weird how it worked out, because we had Mother's Day and then Memorial Day, and there was one in there that it just wasn't going to work for Mike and I to both be on. I think I was in Alaska and he had stuff going on. So the month of June, I think we have Father's Day that we're taking off, but otherwise, clear on sailing every Sunday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Next week, we are actually talking to a gal on handling domestic disputes in the church and domestic incidents. And so I was able to connect with a domestic abuse survivor. And so she's going to come on the broadcast and actually talk about her situation. And she's got an amazing story, fascinating story about how God really protected her and took her out of a very abusive situation. And so I think you'll enjoy hearing that, because it's a pretty awesome story.
Well, it's good to hear from the other perspective. If we're trying to think through the lens of what are we trying to protect against and what might happen and where are we going. So sometimes it's really good to hear a real world story about what did happen, and that can help shape that mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's it. It is. And I think I don't want to give too much of it away, but I think one of the keys with it was she did attend church, and people at church saw it but didn't do anything and in the situation. And so I asked her, she was kind of like, well, why do you want to talk to me? And I said, well, because of exactly what you said. Like, if they weren't successful, like what can we look for? What do we know? Like, you lived through this and came out of it. God was gracious and protected you in so many ways and got you out of that situation. So how can we be more responsive and understand and be supportive as well? So But yeah, she great speaker, and I'm looking forward to having a chance to talk to her next week. So you definitely want to join us for that. And as always, we will talk to you next week. So have a great week. God bless. Take care. We'll talk to you soon.
This hour of broadcasting brought to you by TwoWayRadioCenter.com, a Motorola value-added reseller. Thank you for joining the Church Safety Guys broadcast, brought to you by Vigilant Impact. We hope that you found it informative, and we appreciate your feedback and interaction. Be sure to share our broadcast with your teams, join the discussion online, and connect with us on social media. For other great ministry resources, download the Church Security app or at our website at churchsafetyguys.com. Remember, keep a servant's heart, a mindset of ministry, and semper disciplina. Always be training. Have a blessed week.